Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning into today's webinar. With us today is Bill Eiser with Eiser Coastal Consulting. Bill received his BS and MS in marine science from the University of South Carolina. He has over 30 years of professional experience in coastal zone management in South Carolina. From 1984 through 1989, he worked at Coastal Science and Engineering, where he served as project manager for numerous shoreline assessment and beach erosion studies. From 1989 through 2015, he worked as a regulatory project manager with South Carolina's Coastal Zone Management Agency, the Department of Health and Environmental Control, Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management, or OCRM. In this capacity, he established the positions of the agency's beachfront jurisdictional lines, called the baseline and setback line, reviewed beachfront permit applications for projects such as residential construction and beach renourishment, and wrote a series of annual State of the Beaches reports. He is extremely familiar with OCRM's regulatory programs and permitting requirements for beachfront construction. Since January 2016, he has been providing consulting services and expert witness testimony related to beach erosion issues, beachfront jurisdictional lines, and the beachfront permitting process in South Carolina as president of Eiser Coastal Consulting. In today's webinar, Bill will explain the way the lines are calculated, the specific limitations on construction that are controlled by the line positions, and the recent changes to the beach law that went into effect in May 2018. And now I'll turn it over to you, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, to briefly summarize, the presentation today is going to be about how the state regulates oceanfront construction. And I think it's helpful in a situation like this to have some perspective on how the state has sort of evolved their regulatory jurisdiction over the years. So the title of this is The History of Beachfront Management in South Carolina, but we're certainly going to be talking about the current situation, the current regulations, and how the statute actually controls what people can and cannot do at the state level with their oceanfront property. So having said that, let's just jump right into it. Beach management sounds like it should be pretty simple, and there's actually a section in the statute under legislative findings that says erosion is a natural process which becomes a significant problem for man only when structures are erected in close proximity to the beach dune system. Well, that sounds pretty simple. I don't think anybody would disagree with that statement, and it seems like a good foundation for managing the beach. The problem is that we didn't really start early enough with that philosophy. And this is a slide from North Myrtle Beach. It's actually Cherry Grove back in 1996, before the very first beach renourishment project was constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers. And it shows what a lot of South Carolina's beaches were looking at by the 80s or mid 1990s, which is houses built a little too close to the beach, an inadequate timber bulkhead that was built to try to stop the erosion to some degree. And then as the erosion progresses and you lose sand from the ocean side of that of the beach, you begin to lose the beach itself at high tide. And so typically in a situation like this, people might be staying for a week or two and say, you know, there really wasn't much beach there at high tide. Maybe next year we should try North Carolina or try Florida. So that was the issue that people were dealing with, or the state was dealing with, by the 1990s. How did we get to that point? Well, prior to 1977, the state had no coastal management program. And then in 1977, the state kind of got into the business of managing the coast, but it had very limited jurisdiction. From 1977 through 1988, there was a line called a critical line, which the state still uses to mark off their marshfront jurisdiction. But the critical line was set at the landward toe of the primary dune. And just to get some definitions straight, the primary dune is the dune that's closest to the ocean. You can typically think of it as having a toe on the ocean side and then a toe on the landward side. And the toe just means where the dune kind of stops dropping down so steeply and the ground starts to level off. So the critical line was set at the landward toe of the primary dune, or for an eroding beach that didn't even have a dune, that vertical drop off from high ground down to the beach is called the scarp line. And that erosion scarp line was the critical line. So the state did not have any jurisdiction landward of that line. And if there was an erosional situation, seawall permits were routinely issued or allowed. So from 1977 through 1988, that's how the state was doing business when it came to regulating oceanfront construction. Very limited jurisdiction, a line of jurisdiction that was set pretty close to the beach. So the net result was that by the mid-1980s, this, which was actually Kiowa Island during the 1980s, I was down there doing some beach erosion surveys for the Kiowa developers when this picture was taken. So by the mid-1980s, too much of our coastline, instead of looking like that, was starting to look like this. Now, this is Myrtle Beach, probably in the late 1980s, maybe early 1990s. Again, before the first big beach renourishment project was ever done. So the beach looks a lot different now than when this picture was taken. But contrasted to the previous picture from Cherry Grove, this is a much more substantial concrete seawall that was built to give some protection to the swimming pool and hotel that were right behind it. There's a lot of rock at the base of it to protect the concrete wall, the vertical structure, from the wave action at high tide. And you can see, obviously, there's very little sand on the beach. And if you look closely, you can see two people that are standing in the water, probably wondering what in the world happened to the beach and how do we ever come to this point where there was no wide sandy beach that people could enjoy. So in 1987, in recognition of the fact that too much of our coastline did not have a nice wide sandy beach, the state formed a blue ribbon committee, and it was charged with studying the effects of unregulated oceanfront development and the proliferation of seawalls up and down the coast. The overall concern was that tourism revenue might decline if we couldn't maintain our wide sandy beaches that South Carolina had become famous for. And the Blue Ribbon Committee recommended changes be made to the 1977 Coastal Zone Management Act. So basically they were saying the way that the state had been regulating oceanfront construction for the past 10 years wasn't really adequate. It wasn't doing a good enough job of protecting the state's beaches. Those changes that were recommended by the Blue Ribbon Committee were actually adopted the next year in a piece of legislation that's referred to as the Beachfront Management Act. It was actually an amendment to the original 1977 Coastal Zone Management Act, but because it changed things so significantly, it got its own name, and so people generally called it the Beachfront Management Act. It was passed back in 1988. It established two lines of jurisdiction, the baseline and the 40-year setback line. So neither one of those is called a critical line. The state stopped using the term critical line back in 1988, but the 40-year setback line marks off the most landward extent of the state's permitting jurisdiction. So if you think of the critical area as being what the state regulates, then you probably could say that the 40-year setback line is the critical line because the state doesn't regulate on the landward side, but does regulate on the ocean side. The Beachfront Management Act also established long-term erosion rates measured in feet per year for every inhabited or developed island or beach in the state of South Carolina. Those rates were calculated about every 2,000 feet, although there were some places where the erosion rates were calculated every 1,000 feet. It establishes the line position, the baseline and the setback line, and it also establishes an erosion rate disclosure requirement for real estate sales. So that standard real estate contracts that you're probably very familiar with, there's a box on there that you can check whether or not the property is affected by the Coastal Zone Management Act. And for beachfront property, that would mean, is there a baseline or a setback line that's located on any portion of this property? Is there a structure on the property that's affected by either one of these lines? Under the statute, these line positions and erosion rates are updated every 7 to 10 years. That was most recently done all the way through the process between 2008 and 2010. And I was working at OCRM at the time, and that was one of my primary responsibilities, was coming up with those line positions. I can also tell you that under that 7 to 10 year update schedule, OCRM released proposed new line positions back in October 2017, which is another story that we're going to get into towards the end of this presentation. So how does this process work? How do you establish these line positions? Well, there's two things that you have to keep in mind. First of all, the law has two very different ways of establishing these lines. If you are close to an inlet on a beach, in other words, if you're on a very small island that's got inlets on both ends, or if you're on a long section of beach but has inlets on both ends, those inlet zones have a different method for establishing the lines. If you're not close to an inlet, you're in what's called a standard zone, which basically means not an inlet zone. So in those areas away from inlets, the baseline is drawn at the crest of the primary dune. For inlet zones, it's a completely different method. The baseline is drawn at the most landward shoreline position during the past 40 years. So for the standard zones, it's the present day dune crest. For the inlet zones, you've got to get aerial photographs or surveys that go back 40 years, and you have to figure out where was the most erosional point in the past 40 years, where was the most landward shoreline, and that becomes the baseline positions for these inlet zones. Then the setback line is drawn landward of the baseline, and the distance that you go back is 40 times the long-term erosion rate, which again is measured in feet per year. So if the erosion rate is a foot per year, the setback line is 40 feet back. If the erosion rate is 10 feet per year, which there are places in the state where it's that high, the setback line is 400 feet back. At a minimum, the setback distance is always 20 feet. So if you have an area where the erosion rate is 0, where the beach is stable, well, 40 times 0 is 0, but the statute says under that circumstance, there's always going to be at least a 20-foot minimum setback line. And then secondly, and we'll get into this a little later as well, but the setback line is not a no-build line. The state does allow construction on the ocean side of the setback line, and I think it's a fairly common misconception that the setback line prohibits any construction on the ocean side, and that's not really the case. But again, we'll get into that in a little bit. All right, so this is an aerial photograph showing the baseline in red and the 40-year setback line in blue. This is Myrtle Beach. And the takeaway point from this slide is that even though every oceanfront parcel is partially affected by these line positions, most of those houses and in-ground swimming pools are not affected. So you can have a situation where an oceanfront house is not in the state's permitting jurisdiction. So if any of those houses were ever destroyed by fire or a hurricane and needed to be rebuilt, or if someone wanted to tear it down and rebuild it, or put an addition on the existing house, they'd be, for the most part, out of the state's or OCRM's permitting authority to do that. They'd still have to deal with the local government, but you cannot assume that every oceanfront structure in the state of South Carolina is affected by these lines, because they're not. Another scenario, and this is wild dunes on the Isle of Palms. Again, the baseline is the red line and the blue line is the 40-year setback line. This is a situation where the lines are going so far back on the left side of this picture that they're affecting second row lots. So it's never safe to assume that a second row property is unaffected by these lines. You really have to look at the map to figure out what's in and what's out and where these lines are located. And I've got the Lucas Lodge highlighted on this slide because we're going to talk a little bit about the Lucas takings case and how it actually changed the Beachfront Management Act. So to jump back to 1988, when the law first passed, the new beachfront restrictions that went into effect in 1988 said no new construction seaward of the baseline. Now that was taken out in 1990, but to begin with, the state was being very restrictive and saying you cannot build anything seaward of the baseline. It also said new construction between the baseline and the 40-year setback line could be allowed. It was limited to 5,000 square feet of heated space, and it was approved with an agency authorization letter, not a permit, which is a pretty important distinction because every permit that OCRM issues can be appealed. There's a public notice process that you go through. Anybody who's unhappy with the agency decision can appeal it. The construction between the baseline and setback line was just done with an agency authorization letter, not a permit, so there was really no window for anybody to appeal it. Third bullet point. In 1988, the state banned the construction of new seawalls, and that was a very significant policy change to say that we're not going to allow anybody with an erosion problem to build the seawall along the coast of South Carolina. And then the last bullet point is that back in 1988, the law said that existing seawalls, if they were destroyed, could be replaced with sloping structures no more than 10 feet from the building foundation. That was only in effect for 2 years. That was taken out in 1990, but it was in effect when Hurricane Hugo came through in '89, so that was pretty significant. So the first test of the new law was Hurricane Hugo, which came through in September of 1989. This is a photograph of Devereux Colony, which is just north of Georgetown, showing oceanfront houses and a timber bulkhead, which is partially buried in the sand. This is almost the exact same location with a photograph that I took maybe 2 or 3 days after Hugo. You can see that the wall's been destroyed. All the sand that was behind the wall has been washed out. And most of those houses have experienced very significant damage when Hugo came through. So that was the first test of the law, which was passed in 1988 again. But the second test was a lawsuit that was brought by a guy named David Lucas, who owned 2 lots in Wild Dunes, which is a gated community on the Isle of Palms. The Lucas lots were totally seaward of the baseline, which meant they were unbuildable under the 1988 version of the law. And if you think back to that slide that I just showed about where the line positions were, this section of Wild Dunes is an unstabilized inlet zone. So the baseline was drawn at the most landward point of erosion at any point during the past 40 years, back when that work was done in 1988 or 89. And they were put that far landward because the Lucas lots were actually underwater at high tide back during the 1960s, and the beach had built out since then. But because of the way the law was structured, the baseline was drawn where it was, and then the Lucas lots were rendered unbuildable because of that. Lucas sued, claiming that the state had taken all economic value of his property. The case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor in 1992. And then the Supreme Court remanded the case back down to the state for a damage award. Well, while that case was working its way up through the legal system between 1989 and 1992, the General Assembly, I think, became a little concerned about what the state's liability would be if we lost the Lucas case. So they changed the law in 1990. They revised the Beachfront Management Act and said that construction seaward of the baseline can now be authorized under what the law calls a special permit, and you could go up to 5,000 square feet. But while they were doing that, they also said that that section that said destroyed seawalls could be replaced with sloping structures not more than 10 feet out. That was taken out of the statute. They basically said that destroyed seawalls could not be rebuilt. Now, to begin with, the General Assembly was very generous with what they call destroyed. They said that if the damage exceeded 80%, then it was considered destroyed. Then in the year 1995, that threshold dropped to 66 2/3. So if the damage exceeded that, it was considered destroyed. And then in the year 2005, it dropped to 50%. So that's the way the law's been enforced ever since 2005. If an existing oceanfront seawall is more than 50% damaged, it cannot be rebuilt. And then just as another point, the damage threshold for houses is 66 2/3. So if you have a house that is more than 2/3 damaged, you have to get permission from the state to rebuild it. If it's less than 2/3 damage, you can rebuild it as is, exactly to the same specifications, same footprint and whatnot. So what happened with the Lucas lawsuit? Well, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled and remanded the case back to the state, it was settled out of court. The state actually issued 2 of these special permits to Lucas and then purchased the lots for $425,000 each. There was an additional award of $725,000 for temporary damages and attorney's fees. So the total award was $1.575 million. The state turned around and sold those lots to a private developer, transferred those special permits, and then the lots were built on, one in 1995 and one in 1998. So this is a photograph of the first Lucas house under construction in 95. The second Lucas lot is the vacant lot just to the very right of that slide. The 2 lots are not adjoining. There's an existing house in the middle that was built back in the 1970s. So while that house was being constructed, there was a very large sand shoal that started to work its way onto the beach. It was being pushed by waves and currents. And what happened as that sand shoal was coming in, and I'm trying to use the cursor on the screen as a pointer, as that sand shoal was coming in, it sort of acted as a big breakwater and caused an extreme buildup of sand right here, but it also caused an erosion arc to form right where I'm indicating. And that's where the Lucas slots are located, right where the erosion was getting pretty bad. So this is the same house on the left after construction was finished. The second Lucas lot was still vacant. They were experiencing very extreme erosion during that event back in '97. And it turned out they had about 150 feet of erosion over about 18 months. So this is a very dynamic area because that sand shoal was coming in. It really upset the equilibrium of the beach, and they experienced some pretty significant erosion during that 1.5-year time period. That beach has since been renourished, and it doesn't look this way at all anymore, but it's still a very dynamic beach where we see a lot of accretion and erosion over the years. So jumping back to what you can do under these special permits seaward of the baseline. The regulations say that you can go up to 5,000 square feet of heated space, but you cannot go any larger than the largest house in the area. So if you're in an area like Isle of Palms, Wild Dunes, where most of those houses were already exceeding 5,000 square feet of heated space, that's how big you can go. You can go up to 5,000 square feet. If you are seaward of the baseline on a place like Harbor Island, which is a very small sea island down in Beaufort County, those existing houses were all in the order of 3,500 to 3,800 square feet. So to build seaward of the baseline in those areas, you couldn't go any larger than the largest, which was about 3,800 square feet. Second bullet point, the house has to go as far landward as practical, and you can never go any further seaward than your neighboring houses. So if you've got a vacant lot, you can basically pull a string from the corner of the house to your left to the corner of your house to the right, and your house on the vacant lot cannot go on the ocean side of that string. Third bullet point, you cannot build a house on the primary dune, which is that dune closest to the ocean, and you cannot build on what they call active beach, which is the beach on the ocean side of that primary dune. You cannot incorporate a seawall as part of the foundation of your house because that would violate the prohibition on new seawalls. So OCRM always looks very closely at your foundation plans just to make sure that you're not actually building a seawall and saying that it's your house foundation. If the house is ever located on the active beach, it must be removed. Now, that has never been enforced, so it's never been tested in court. And I think potentially at some point in the future, there may be a lawsuit that's brought over that point, and we'll see what the courts have to say about it. But every house that was built under a special permit has that restriction on it. And here lately, those permits have actually required the property to be deed restricted, so that if a subsequent owner down the line ever has an extreme erosion event and the beach is coming up or the water's coming up under the house at high tide, the house is on the active beach, then that new owner is still required to remove the house. Keep in mind, that doesn't apply to every oceanfront house in the state of South Carolina. It only applies to the ones that were built seaward of the baseline after 1990 when the law got changed. And at last count, I think there were around 65 houses in the whole state that fell in that category. So it's not every house, it's just these, let's say 65 houses that were built under a special permit seaward of the baseline. Last bullet point here is that since the 1992 U.S. Supreme Court Lucas ruling, no property owner has been denied construction of a new house seaward of the baseline. There have been situations where people wanted to put additions or in-ground swimming pools on the ocean side of an existing house, and some of those permits were denied, but there's never been an instance where someone with a vacant lot who wanted to build the house and was trying to follow all the rules was denied a permit. And I think that's a reflection of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling saying that if you don't allow someone with a vacant lot to have a reasonable use of their oceanfront land, that it is a taking and potentially the state's going to be liable for the value of that lot. Okay, switching topics here just a little bit. There are structures along the coast that kind of jut out into the ocean. These short perpendicular structures are called groins. They're usually made of rock. Sometimes they're made of aluminum sheet pile. There are several of these on Edisto that are actually made out of timber, but they are not considered erosion control structures by the state of South Carolina, and they can be permitted under certain circumstances. The way these structures work, and again, I'm using the cursor to try to indicate this. Here's one groin right here, and then here's another groin right here. And then you've got a certain amount of sand that's trapped between these two structures. And regardless of which way the current is running or which way the wind and waves are going, whatever sand is trapped between these two structures pretty much tends to stay put. So they are sand trapping structures. But if you have a good high tide with storm conditions, on top of that, the ocean waves can come right up the beach and still cause erosion on the shoreline up here. So that's why they're not considered erosion control structures. They don't stop the landward migration or retreat of the beach if it's erosional. They simply trap sand between the two structures on the beach out here. And the state can issue permits for those to be built under certain pretty limited circumstances. Okay, so if you have an erosion problem and the state doesn't allow you to build a new seawall, what can you do? Well, generally these are referred to as the 3 A's of responses to beach erosion. Armor the shoreline, you cannot do that in South Carolina. That's been outlawed since '88. You can abandon the property, although in my experience over the past 30 years, nobody wants to walk away from a multi-million-dollar oceanfront lot because they have an erosion problem. So typically what people wind up doing is accreting the beach. And there's actually a section in the law, in the Beachfront Management Act, that says that the policy of South Carolina is to promote carefully planned renourishment as a means of beach preservation and restoration where it's economically feasible. So if most of our shoreline is developed, if you can't armor the shoreline, if you can't build seawalls and bulkheads, if nobody's going to walk away from an oceanfront property, then the solution in most cases is to add sand to the beach, to accrete the beach. Beach renourishment in the state of South Carolina is a pretty big business. It averages about $3 million annually in state funding. That doesn't include federal funding, that doesn't include local funding, doesn't include private funding. But it can range anywhere from $0 to $5 million per year because there is no dedicated state funding source. It's sort of at the whim of the General Assembly as to what year's money is allocated for beach renourishment. That state money is usually matched with federal or local dollars, and the state money cannot be spent on beaches that don't have adequate public access. And public access doesn't mean that anybody can rent a house in a private community for a week or two. Public access means day use. It means that anybody can drive to a beach, maybe pay a reasonable fee to park, and then get out onto the beach for the day. If you don't have that kind of public access, then you don't qualify for public money, and you also don't qualify for federal money for beach renourishment. Although in some instances like that, local money or POA or HOA money or even private individuals' money can be used to pay for beach renourishment. And then typically in the state of South Carolina, we see about one large renourishment project per year. Recently, we've had projects at Isle of Palms, Hilton Head Island, and there's actually an ongoing beach renourishment project at Folly Beach right now. So this is what beach renourishment can look like. This is a picture from 1990 when Seabrook Island was doing beach renourishment. What you're seeing there is a large ocean-going dredge that is dredging sand from the ocean floor and then pumping that sand-water mixture through this floating pipeline, which kind of comes off the picture and then comes back onto the picture and then makes a right-hand turn, and you can barely see that there's some pipeline along the beach. And then right here is where that sand and water mixture is being discharged from the end of the pipe. And there's like a big bulldozer right there that's kind of pushing the sand around to try to build the beach up some. This is a section of beach that they've already finished, and this is a section that they're currently working on right now. This is from the 1996 Myrtle Beach Renourishment Project. That's the pipeline that's going up the beach. So they're pumping that sand water mixture through the pipe further up the beach where it's being discharged and then shaped by bulldozers or heavy equipment. And there were a lot of people looking at that sand that was just pumped up a week or two ago because that's probably got a lot of good shells or even shark's teeth in it. that nobody's been able to pick over yet because a month ago that sand was 2 or 3 miles offshore. This is the 2008 Isle of Palms beach renourishment project. That was the first major renourishment project that was done on Isle of Palms. This is where that pipeline comes in from maybe 2 or 3 miles offshore. Previously, the pipe took a right-hand turn and they pumped the sand all up onto this area right here. That's all newly renourished beach. Right now, the pipe is taking the left-hand turn, and you can see that this section of beach looks a little newer, it looks wetter. And so this is what they've been doing more recently, and then they're working just off the slide to the left on that picture. So anyways, that's kind of a summary of how things worked for the most part from 1988 through 2017. And then some pretty interesting things happened last fall. OCRM released proposed new line positions statewide in October 2017 with a limited 30-day public comment period before a proposed final adoption of all these lines in December. I can tell you that back when I was working for the agency, these line revisions statewide, it was typically an 18-month to 24-month period or time period that this was done in, and OCRM kind of compressed that down to about 2 months. The agency also relied on data that was collected right after Hurricane Matthew in 2016, which had caused some pretty significant erosion along the coast. And because of that, the proposed new lines moved significantly landward in many areas. This is an example from Kiowa Island where you can see both the old lines and the proposed new lines. So that red line is the old baseline, that blue line is the old setback line. Those are the lines that I drew back in 2009. That dashed green line is the proposed new baseline, and then much further back, that dashed purple line is the proposed new setback line. So the state had proposed to go with a much higher erosion rate in this area, which was going to cause that setback line to move back a lot. So the consequence of that is that all these oceanfront houses, which have been built out of the state's jurisdiction, were now going to be in the state's jurisdiction. So they would be regulated if they wanted to put an addition on the house or rebuild the house after it was destroyed. It also meant that anybody that had a vacant lot in this area was going to be restricted to 5,000 square feet of heated space, whereas most of these houses are probably in the 7,000 to 8,000 square foot range. So anyone with a vacant lot was going to be not stuck with, but would wind up with a much smaller house than everybody else in that area. This is another example where the baseline and setback line were further out on the beach, and then the proposed new baseline and setback line, those are the dashed lines, were going further back. This is a pretty stable area. You can see that there's a pretty substantial looking, what they call maritime forest back behind these lines, but this is an area that had some erosion because of Hurricane Matthew, and because the erosion had gone as far back as the edge of the pine trees and wax myrtles, that's where the state was proposing to put the new lines, in spite of the fact that this has historically been a pretty stable or even accretional beach building area. So after all this came out for the public to review in October and November 2017, there was a lot of public outcry. People were saying that this was happening way too fast. They didn't have time to really process what it meant or raise some reasonable concerns or objections to it. So because of that, the law was amended back in May of 2018. And the new version of the law says that data collected immediately after a named storm event cannot be used, which meant that all that data that was collected right after Hurricane Matthew, it was not appropriate to use it. The definition of primary dune must be revised by a stakeholder work group. The primary dune is used to set the baseline for these standard zones, and currently the definition says that the dune has to be 3 feet high and 500 feet long. Well, it turns out there's a lot of places in the state where the dune is not quite 5 feet, not quite 3 feet high, or not quite 500 feet long, but yet if you went there and looked at it, you would probably say, oh, it looks like the primary dune to me. So anyways, the new law says that the definition has to be revised, and OCRM has convened what they're calling a stakeholder work group with representation from the South Carolina Realtors Association, by the way, to try to come up with a better working definition of primary dune. The law also says that OSRM must redo this line revision process starting in the year 2024, but until then, the controlling line, the jurisdictional line, is either the more seaward of the 2009 line or the proposed 2017 line. So whichever line is closer to the ocean, either the one from 2009 or the one from 2017, that's the controlling line until at least the year 2024. One other thing that they did was they changed the beachfront policy of retreat, which had been in effect since 1988, to a policy of preservation. So for roughly 30 years, we've been telling people that you're supposed to retreat from the beach because that's the state's policy. We're now saying that the policy is to preserve what we have, to not allow people to go closer to the ocean, but not to expect that they're going to be moving further away from the ocean. And I'm not too sure exactly what kind of implications that policy change is going to have, but I think it's interesting to point out that the mandate that the General Assembly is giving to the state agencies now is you're not expected to get people to retreat from the beach. We're just trying to preserve what we already have. So to summarize what all this means, the Beachfront Management Act has a 40-year setback line, which marks off the state's jurisdiction, but that is not a no-build line. You can build between the setback line and the baseline. You can even build on the ocean side of the baseline, but that setback line does have a material impact on the use of beachfront property. If you have a large piece of structure that's a large piece of property that's zoned commercial and you want to build a multi-story structure, a condominium or a hotel, you're probably not going to be able to do that unless you can keep that entire structure on the landward side of the 40-year setback line. Second bullet point, new house construction is limited to 5,000 square feet of heated space and must be as far landward as possible. So the idea is that you're trying to keep the house as far away from the beach as it can go, which is really designed to protect the structure and also to enhance the public's beach. Third bullet point, existing houses can be rebuilt to the same size if they're destroyed, but must be moved further landward if possible. That only applies if the damage to the house exceeds 2/3. And I talked about this a little while ago. If a house is damaged, but the damage does not exceed 2/3, you can rebuild it exactly where it was. If the house damage exceeds 2/3, you can build it to the same size, but you have to move it further landward if it's possible to do that. No new swimming pools are allowed seaward of the setback line unless there is a seawall or revetment that's in place to give it some protection. No new seawalls or revetments can be built seaward of the setback line. So if you don't have a wall already, you're not going to be able to build one. That prohibition has been in effect since 1988. And then existing walls cannot be rebuilt if they're damaged more than 50%. And that damage assessment is done on the part of the wall that's visible, what they call above grade. You might have 10 or 15 feet of the wall going down into the sand, but if the whole thing was broken off at beach level during a major storm, you don't get credit for what's in the ground. You only get credit for the part that actually can be seen and assessed. So that is, in one slide, kind of a summary of what the state is allowing. It's reasonable use of the property, meaning you can have a house that's up to 5,000 square feet, but it is a limitation on new commercial structures going into the state's jurisdiction, just because those are usually much larger than 5,000 square feet. Existing houses can be rebuilt if they're destroyed, although they might have to be moved a little further landward if the damage was pretty significant. And then new seawalls are not allowed, but existing ones can be rebuilt if the damage does not exceed 50%. So that's the last slide that I have. So at this point, Jennifer, if you want to see if we have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
All right, Bill, thank you so much for that. We're going to take a couple minutes and see if anybody has any questions for you. While we're waiting, I would like to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our website and YouTube page this afternoon. You can find all of our webinars at youtube.com/screaltors and at screaltors.org/webinar. And I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So we'll give it a couple more minutes just in case.
Sure, that's fine. And while we're waiting to see if any questions come in, let me tell you that this dune working group that OCRM has convened, the first meeting is going to be held in October. They're expecting to have a final product by the end of January, and that product would simply be a revised definition of primary dune, which is going to be very important because that's where the baseline gets drawn for these standard zones. And then they're also being asked to come up with a reasonable definition of what is a significant storm. If the law says you cannot use data that was collected after a significant storm, how do you actually implement that? If there's a named storm that passed 50 miles offshore, but it was only a tropical storm or a Category 1, would that count? If you had a Category 5 storm that moved by 150 miles offshore, you might actually see more or less damage from that. So how do you factor in the extent of erosion from a storm as to whether or not you should be allowed to use data that's collected right after that storm? So Nick Romides is actually a member of that work group, and I'm sure he'll be passing along to the members what the final results are from that work group.
All right, Bill, it does look like we have a couple questions coming in. So the first question is from Mark, and he wants to know who issues the permits.
Okay, the permits are issued by DHEC OCRM. OCRM stands for Ocean and Coastal Resource Management. They are a division of DHEC, the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. Their main office is in Charleston. They've got a branch office in Myrtle Beach and a branch office in Beaufort. And all these permits are processed and issued or denied by staff people working at OCRM.
All right, thank you. Next question is from Teresa. She says the square foot is limited on new construction to 5,000 square feet. Is there a limitation to outside unheated square footage?
There's no limitation, and that's actually a very good question. There's no limitation on the outside square footage, but you need to be mindful of the fact that the state is going to look at how close to the ocean you're going with, let's say, an attached deck. If that's what you have in mind, and it's going to be looking at the houses on either side. If the new house is going to be going seaward of the baseline, to make sure that the attached deck cannot, go any closer to the ocean than the houses on either side. But there is no outright limitation on the size of any attached decks that are not heated and cooled.
All right, the next question is from Joyce. Next question is from Joyce Hampton. She wants to know, are the requirements for the same for areas like James Island?
No, this only applies to oceanfront property. So like in Charleston County, it would not apply to James Island. It would apply to Dewey's Island. I'm just sort of like geographically go down the coast. Oceanfront at Dewey's, Isle of Palms, Sullivan's, then you jump across the harbor to Folly Beach, Kiowa Island, and Seabrook Island. But James Island, Johns Island, Mount Pleasant, none of so these rules don't apply. Now, if you have marshfront property or creekfront property on James Island, the state is going to regulate your dock, or if you want to build a bulkhead, regulate your bulkhead, and then the town, either the town of James Island or the city of Charleston, or maybe even Charleston County, is going to probably impose a setback for construction that's measured from the critical line, which is the edge of the marsh. But again, nothing that I was just talking about would apply to any parcel on James Island, because that's not oceanfront.
All right, next question is from David. He says, whether representing a buyer or seller, where can a real estate agent get information on the property about what we spoke about on the internet, or calling it a government agency in South Carolina?
Sure. Well, if you're dealing with a oceanfront parcel that has a baseline and setback line on it, and then maybe even a structure on it, the first thing that you want to do would be to contact DHEC OCRM and make sure that you have the most recent current jurisdictional line position information, so you know exactly where the lines are, that you're not using an older plat from, say, the year 1998, and those lines are not current anymore. And then once you've got the line positions confirmed, typically the way you can meet that disclosure requirement is simply have a plat that shows the lines, shows the parcel boundaries, shows the location of any improvements like a house or a garage, and then also states what the long-term erosion rate for that area is. But you probably will end up working with a surveyor to meet that requirement, but the first place that you want to start asking questions would be with the OCRM staff.
All right. Teresa says, where do you take concerns about builders not conforming to Beachfront Management Act and building too close to the ocean?
I would probably talk to either your local building official, either at the municipal or county level, because these guys are all aware of what the state's requirements are. But then I would also talk to OCRM staff. Sometimes there's a situation where somebody pulls a local building permit, but they think they're out of the state's jurisdiction, so they don't even contact OCRM. And so in that case, OCRM staff may not even be aware of what's going on. But in almost every instance, there was a local building permit that the contractor had to pull. So I think you definitely want to check with the local building official and see what the history is on that.
All right. What are some of the services that you could be hired to provide to realtors and their clients?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Basically, I am assisting property owners and real estate agents or developers with understanding where these lines are located, what are the implications of these lines, what can you do, what can you can't do, and then assisting people with the permitting process through OCRM if it turns out that what they're doing does actually require a permit. Sometimes they get phone calls from people that just have an erosion problem. They think that the beach is washing away and they're not too sure what might be causing it, or they want to know what they can do in response to it. So basically any questions having to do with beach erosion, the state's permitting jurisdiction, or how you can proceed with getting a permit to do certain things, that's kind of my niche market. That's the services that I'm offering.
All right, it looks like this is our last one. Philip wants to know if you have any comments on the Sea Pines residents at Hilton Head that built the underground bulkhead.
Yeah, that's a really interesting situation. And for those of you that aren't aware of it or following it, there were some property owners at Sea Pines that had experienced some erosion because of either Matthew or Irma, I'm not too sure which, and got a little concerned that if we had some more storms that things might get worse and worse. So they located the OCRM 40-year setback line on their properties and then had a contractor build a bulkhead just landward of that 40-year setback line, which put it out of the state's jurisdiction. So OCRM is saying there really wasn't anything we could do to stop it. It wasn't in our jurisdiction. The town of Hilton Head actually had to issue some kind of environmental impact permit for that structure, but I guess the town's ordinances don't prohibit that from being done. And I can tell you that since that was in the newspaper in Charleston, I've gotten several phone calls from people saying, hey, could I do something similar? And I think you need to check with your local government jurisdiction and see what kind of ordinances might come into play. But I don't want to say it's a loophole, but it's certainly a feature of the law that the state doesn't regulate or doesn't prohibit new seawalls if they're going landward of the 40-year setback line. And depending on how deep an oceanfront lot is and where these lines are located, and if there's a house on the property that somebody is understandably nervous about and wants to see if they can do something to protect it, that might be an opportunity for somebody to actually put some additional structure out there that will give them some benefit during a storm. Again, you have to be careful though, because the local government would have to be involved in approving it, and there may be other sections of DHEC, like the stormwater or land disturbance permitting sections, that might still require what they call a land disturbance permit for that structure. But it's interesting that the outright prohibition on erosion control structures only applies on the ocean side of the 40-year setback line, and there's some people at Hilton Head that built their structure that was on the landward side. So we'll have to see if other people up and down the coast want to do something similar.
Right. Hang on just a second, I'm having an audio issue. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions right now. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to come and present today for us, Bill. It's been a pleasure having you here. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end?
I think that's it, Jennifer. Thanks for your help, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today.
All right, thank you very much.